you have a Bible, go ahead and grab it. Open up to John 1 with me. If you didn't bring a Bible, there's always Bibles just in the seat in front of you, right on the basket right in front of you. I actually don't ever bring my Bible to church, so I always grab that one right in front of me. So, in fact, I had to borrow a Bible this morning. So, we're going to be in John 1, and the big idea for what we're going to be learning about today is God. Now, I know that might be surprising to some of you to come to church and hear that we're teaching on God, but that's what I was assigned to teach on today, and so we're going to be learning about God. That's actually my intro. That's my catchy, witty intro for you. So we're going to read John 1:18. In fact, I'm going to back up to verse 14 so we can get the context, because we really just have one verse to focus in on today, just one verse. So read with me John 1, starting in verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And here's our verse for today. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Would you pray with me? Father, I look forward to seeing you this morning through your word. And God, I ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts would be pleasing to you. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. It's in his name we pray, amen. So that's our text today, John 1:18, which says, no one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Now, there's an underlying assumption that the author, John, is kind of operating out of in this text. And that assumption goes like this. All of us were created with the desire to know and see God. All of us, every human was created with the desire to know and to see God. Now, this isn't that hard to notice in people. In just regular conversation, you can notice with people when people say things like, I wonder what else is out there. Like, what's really going on beyond the surface of things? Where did we come from? Why are we here? What's our purpose? What does this all mean? These questions that everybody wonders, and maybe if you haven't thought about any of those things in a really long time, think back to when you were a child. You thought about those things all the time, trying to figure out what's really going on beyond just what I can see and touch. Those reveal that there's longings in the human heart. There's longings to know and to see God. Now, this is clear in Denver, even just in our city. If you look around, people do and think and operate in many ways that reveal these longings. Things just like yoga, and many people visit psychic mediums in our city. This is like a normal thing people do. There's a lot of new age religious influence. All of that reveals that there's deep spiritual longings in the hearts of people in Denver. In fact, a few years ago, I had frequented this one establishment in Denver and gotten to know one of the guys who worked there. And one day, after just having a lot of casual conversation with him, I just decided to ask him, hey man, I'd love to know what you believe spiritually. This is actually a great question to ask someone if you want to get to know someone really well, or if you want to kind of take a relationship to the next level. Ask someone, what do you believe about all this? And I said, would you explain your spiritual beliefs to me? And he was like, yeah, I would love to. He was like, I'm a really spiritual person. I was like, oh, great. And so we set a time, we got together, and he was just lit up with the opportunity to tell me what he believed in. And he shared it kind of like this. He said, here's a great example of my spirituality, of what I believe spiritually. He said, a few months ago, I was mountain biking, and I was out on this beautiful trail, and all of a sudden, I felt like I needed to stop and look up. And when I did, the sun peered behind a cloud, and at that exact moment, a flock of birds flew directly over me. And I felt this sense of energy in me, that I was connected to the universe and that I was connected to all things, the sun and the mountain and nature, and I felt a unity in all of us. He said, and that's my spirituality. I feel a sense of energy and connection to the universe. Now, this isn't that uncommon of a way that people think about spirituality, especially here in Denver. I think it makes perfect sense that he would think that, because all he was trying to do, he was just trying to make sense of the world as he knew it and look beyond the surface of the mundane. He was trying to make sense and ascribe meaning to the ordinary beauty he witnessed in the world. And so that's, for him, how his spirituality manifests. Now, despite the varied spiritualities that we encounter here in Denver among many people. There's many different types of spiritualities and religious beliefs. The irony is that very few people would say that they are satisfied with or at rest with what they've discovered. Like, have conversations with people. Very few people would say that they're satisfied or they're at rest with their spirituality. And in fact, you can hear this in some of the language people use. They'll say things like, well, I'm spiritual, but I feel like I'm still searching. Or maybe someone encounters a tough situation or a challenge or just a time of pain or suffering in their life, and they'll say things like, I haven't really gotten the answers that I was looking for. And maybe their spirituality isn't at that point a resource that they can draw on to actually sustain them through difficult times. Rather, it's something to be done in private, but it doesn't really make its way into my everyday life. You see this where people are disillusioned with religion. They find it stale. Whatever religion it might be, maybe it just grows old. Or maybe they get to be suspicious of religion or religious beliefs. And in extreme situations, people even see religion as dangerous. So the question is, why are so many people dissatisfied with spirituality? And the answer is in our text. Because no one has ever seen God. No one's really seen him. And so 3 questions we're going to look at that this text brings out are, what does it mean to see God? And why has no one ever seen God? The text tells us no one's ever seen God. Why is that? How has no one ever seen God? How is that possible? And lastly, how does Jesus make him known? So our first question, what does it mean to see God? Now, we know that there's a difference in the way that we talk about seeing people, right? Like when I say I saw my family over Christmas time, none of you in here are thinking that I looked at the Christmas card, right? That I just looked at their Christmas card and was like, I saw my family over Christmas, right? Like you would assume, rightly, that I packed my 5-month-old baby and my 1-year-old puppy into a small mid-size SUV and I drove all the way across the country to Chicago so that I could spend a week with them. Like that's what it meant to see my family, to be with them, right? Like we know there's a difference between seeing our family on Christmas time and if I say I saw you on TV, or if you said we're seeing each other or I'm seeing someone. That's a different type of seeing. I'll give you an example of this. My favorite athlete of all time, especially when I was a kid, is Brian Urlacher, who's a middle linebacker for the Chicago Bears. He's my favorite football player, athlete of all time. And I saw Brian Urlacher. I saw him play on television. But there's another time I got to see him. My elementary school threw a fundraiser where the Chicago Bears players would scrimmage our teachers in basketball. And so that was at my school, so I got to go and I got to see Brian Urlacher play basketball. And I didn't know this at the time, but he's a former All-American high school basketball player, which was a problem for my kindergarten teacher, who was 4'10", who dribbled up under the basket, shot it, of which he came out of nowhere and swatted it, went down to the other side and 360 dunked it. And the crowd was like, snap! Oh, jeez. All right, so I just got to see him then. And then one time I was at church back home, and the pastor said you could get up and greet those standing around you. And I turned around, and 6'4", 260 pounds was standing behind me, Brian Urlacher. And I was 14 years old, and I looked up, I looked left, I looked right, and he said, hi, I'm Brian. And I said, I know. Now, there was a huge difference in seeing him on TV versus seeing him from the stands versus actually being in his presence and shaking his hand and hearing his voice. This is the kind of seeing that this text is talking about when it comes to seeing God. It's talking about being in his presence. Not seeing him from afar, but dwelling with God, to witness his glory, to witness the fullness of his being. It's more than just an outside look at his physical form. It's an up-close experience with a personal being. That's what it means to see God. Okay, so why can't we see him? Why can't we see God? Okay, now this is going to sound strange at first, but I want you to bear with me as I try and explain something to you. I want us to consider something. What if God has chosen not to reveal himself to us in his fullness? What if God has hidden most of himself from the world? What if he's chosen to do this? And what if that's for our good? What if that's a good thing that he's done that? Now think about this. It would make sense for God to just show up and settle the debate about who he is and what he's like once and for all. Like all the different religions, all different spiritualities try and make sense and have different interpretations of who God is and what he's like. It would make sense for him to show up and be like, look, I'm God, now you know, right? But what if he's chosen to hide himself? Now, the best way for us to think about this or to understand this is to think about the sun. The sun is the big flaming ball in the sky, sun, right? Think about the sun. The sun is beautiful. The sun is powerful. The sun is good, and it's the source of life. It gives us what we need, light and heat to survive. Our whole source of life and being comes from the presence of the sun in our solar system, right? The sun is good, but we can't touch it. We can't even really come near it, or we'll burn up and die. In fact, the sun is 93 million miles away, and at about 3 million miles, wearing a spacesuit, we would burn up and die. 3 million miles from the sun. That's like a lot of miles, right? 3 million. That's like the closest we can get to it. Or we would burn up and die. Does that make the sun any less good? No, it's necessary for life. In fact, we can't even look at the sun. Like, think about it. You guys remember when that eclipse happened last year? And it was like the goggles were sold out? Because if you look at the sun, it'll cause permanent damage to your eyes. That's how powerful it is. Now, this illustrates one of God's most essential qualities, and that is his holiness. God's holiness is what sets him apart from the rest of the world because it's his perfect purity. It's his perfect moral goodness, that he is without flaw, that he is without blemish. He's perfect in every way. He's holy. And just as the sun would burn us up if we got too close to it, so would God's holiness, because we are not holy like him. We do not contain that same essence of holiness as him, and so we can't be in his presence. So God has hidden himself from us in order to protect us. He's done it for our good. So no one has ever really seen God, because to see God, to be in his presence, to dwell with him, a holy, perfect God would kill us. Now, this isn't just true for bad people or irreligious people or people who don't believe in God. This isn't just about a certain subset of people who can't be in God's presence. In fact, even the most religious people, even the most spiritual people, even the most moral people on earth cannot see God. And here's an example of this. This is a passage that Hunter taught on a little bit last week out of Exodus 33. This is about Moses, who's like the hero of the Jewish faith. He's one of the greatest men who ever lived. No one in the history of the world has ever been closer to God and in his presence than Moses. And there's this story about when he asks God to show up to him. And here's what happens. He asks God, please show me your glory. And God says, I will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I'll be gracious to whom I'll be gracious and show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But, he said, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. And the Lord said, behold, there's a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Two things have to happen for God to show Moses his glory. The first is covering. He places Moses between, a little crevice in the rock, and God's own hand covers him so that there's a barrier between Moses and God's presence to protect him. And second is that Moses can only see God's back, which is like, you can hardly tell who someone is by their back. Like, have you ever seen someone from behind and you think it's someone you know, and you call out their name and they turn around and it's like you have no idea who they are? So you pretend that you're waving to someone behind them. You're like, Bill, that's you, right? Like you do that thing. Right? You can't really tell who someone is from their back. Moses can only get a glimpse of God's back. And this is the best example we have in the entire Old Testament of someone seeing God. Now, there's another story from the prophet Isaiah, who gets to experience a vision of God's throne room. And I want us to look at how this story goes, because this is another example of someone in God's presence being able to have an experience with him. This is Isaiah 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim, which are like these winged creatures. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for." He only gets a glimpse of God in a vision, Isaiah does. And even through a vision, when he knows that he's next to God's glorious presence, he has an unbelievable sense of his own inadequacy. He cries out, "Woe is me." It's like he woke up in the king's throne room and he showed up in rags and he was like, "What am I wearing? Woe is me." Moses and Isaiah both feel fragile next to God and afraid of his holy presence. Isaiah needs a burning coal to cleanse him from his sins so he could be holy and dwell in the midst of God's holiness. Moses needs God's own hand to cover him and to protect him from God's presence. So if the hero and founder of the Jewish faith and a prophet who was called and commissioned by God can't see him and have that experience with him, what about us? If you or I were to stand in the presence of God, we would feel the same as these two. Imagine now, as best as you can in our finite minds, just try to imagine a magnificent and gloriously beautiful God. Perfect, flawless, pure. If you need to think about the sun or a diamond, the most beautiful, pure thing you can think of. Now think about your life. Think about a time, maybe this last week, where your patience wore thin with a family member and you snapped. Or maybe a time when you chose to be selfish, when you knew that you should give of your time and your energy to someone else. Or have you ever tried to hide or cover up a mistake out of shame or failure? Or is there something that you're just keeping deep down inside you that you would be afraid that anyone would find out? Think about the last time you weren't able to resist temptation or a bad habit and you gave in. Knowing all this about yourself with an honest reflection about who you are and what you're like and your failures, your mistakes, your things you're incapable of doing, what would you say in front of this God? You would cry out, "Woe is me! I am a man of unclean lips. I am a woman of unclean lips." However, here's what's fascinating. Here's what I find fascinating about this. We were actually originally created to not just glimpse bits and pieces of God. We were created originally to be fully in his presence and to dwell with him. In fact, this is why we have spiritual longings in the first place. This is why they're in us. This is C.S. Lewis, who had that famous quote that if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this life can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were created for another world. So in God's original design, we dwelt with him. But it was us who decided to live life apart from God. It was us who decided to say no thank you to his presence and to walk away from his good and perfect will. I remember the story of Adam and Eve when they eat of the fruit of the tree. What is it that drives them away from the presence of God? It's shame over their disobedience. And they cover themselves out of fear of his presence. That line in Genesis 3:8, this is like straight out of, this is just chills you to read. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. That's how close they were to God. He walked in the garden, just to and fro in relationship with them. And when they see God, when they hear him coming, the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. Doesn't that just chill you to the bone? They hide themselves from God. So we can't ultimately see him because we've hidden ourselves from him out of our shame. We've walked away from our original design. And so God is actually protecting us from his holy and pure presence by hiding himself from us too. Which then leads us to Jesus. All right, our third question, how does Jesus make God known? Now, up to this point in history, when John wrote this verse, up to this point, think about this. God has only revealed little bits and pieces of himself. No one's fully seen God. Like, I find that crazy, that never has the full revelation of God been shown. Nobody really knows what he's like, only what little parts of him are like. And nobody's been able to stand in his presence fully until now. Jesus Christ walked on earth as a human to make God fully known in every respect. In every single way Jesus was, in every way that we could see him and be with him and know about him, that's who our God is. We get a clue to how this works in this verse, in verse 18, when it says, "No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side." This phrase, "who is at the Father's side," gives us a clue in the ways in which Jesus is able to do this. In fact, "at the Father's side" is a fine translation. It's helpful for us to kind of understand, but it's not really the full picture. It's actually a translation of what reads in the original Greek manuscript a little more literally, "in the bosom of the Father." Now, I understand why the ESV decided to translate the word "in the bosom of the Father." I mean, bosom is just not a word that we use very oftenly in conversation, is it? It's just, when's the last time you casually dropped the word bosom in conversation? I can't imagine it was that often. But it's actually the best way of capturing what Jesus is all about here and what John is trying to say about him. Now, when you hear the word bosom, I'm imagining that your mind goes to exactly where my mind goes. The beloved Canadian children's novels from the early 1900s, Anne of Green Gables. I just know that if that's where my mind goes, that's got to be where your mind goes, straight to Anne of Green Gables. Now, if you're not married to my wife and you need a little help knowing what Anne of Green Gables is, it's about an orphan girl who's adopted by an older woman and her brother in this small picturesque town called Avonlea. Okay, and as an orphan, she longs for real connection and relationships. And here's how Anne, our main character, describes this longing for friendship to her adopted mother, Marilla. She says, "Marilla, do you think that I shall ever have a bosom friend in Avonlea?" And Marilla says, "A what kind of friend?" She says, "Oh, a bosom friend, an intimate friend, a really kindred spirit to whom I can confide my innermost soul. I've dreamed of meeting her all my life." Okay, now there's two reasons I bring up this extremely strange and arbitrary illustration. The first is it will make my wife really happy, and so that's just worth it for me. Okay, and secondly, it's actually a great description for what John is saying here about Jesus. "In the bosom of the Father" describes the closest and most intimate relationship possible between two humans. One where someone can, as Anne says, confide their innermost soul. It's imagine for a second like a baby, a newborn baby, resting his head on his mother's chest, fully secure, protected, knit together as one. In fact, just a few months ago, the first time my baby girl nuzzled her head in my chest and fell asleep, skin to skin, I just was flooded with emotion I didn't know existed. And I didn't even plan to do this, but I just broke out and I whispered in her ear. She slept on my chest, "I love you and I'll do anything to protect you. And I'm here for you." This was a kind of closeness and intimacy I had never experienced in my life before, as she rested in the bosom of her Father. Jesus has this kind of relationship with his Father. If we came into God's presence, we would yell, "Woe is me," and hide out of terror because of our guilt and our shame in the face of pure beauty and perfection. But Jesus is resting in the bosom of his Father, totally secure. No barrier separates them. Jesus is the perfect, guiltless, holy Son of God. So Jesus shows us the Father because he rests in his presence, totally unharmed in perfect relationship. In fact, a little bit later in John, one of his disciples, Philip, this is after 3 years of ministry with Jesus, alongside Jesus, Philip will say, "Jesus, now will you show us the Father?" And Jesus is grieved. He says, "Philip, have you been with me this long and you still don't know? As you see me, you see the Father, for as the Father is in me, I am in him." In every way, Jesus is the Father. So that's one way that Jesus makes God known. But another way that Jesus makes God known is because he gives unholy people, sinful people, broken people who have hidden themselves from God, he gives them full access to his holy presence. Now, above all, this is actually what Jesus came to give us. Above all, this is why Jesus came to earth. It wasn't a new spirituality. It wasn't a new set of religious principles. It wasn't ethical guidelines or values to follow. Above all, Jesus came to give us God. Moses, if you remember in the story, what did he need to witness God's presence? He needed covering. He needed to be protected by God's hand. Isaiah needed cleansing through that purifying hot coal. Jesus' death on the cross cleanses us from sin and makes us holy, and it covers us with his righteousness so that we can stand in the presence of a holy God unharmed in perfect relationship. It's covering and it's cleansing. And that allows us to be in God's presence. Okay, so what does this look like? Another text that Hunter brought up last week that is a great explanation of how this works is in John 12. And this is where Jesus is nearing his death, and he teaches to a group of people the meaning of what he came to do in his life. This is at John 12, starting in verse 27. Jesus says, "Now is my soul troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven. "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." The crowd that stood there and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said, "An angel has spoken to him." Jesus answered, "This voice has come for your sake, not mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Now notice that God says that he has glorified Jesus and he will glorify him. He has glorified him in that his life and ministry, in every way through Jesus' life and ministry, God revealed himself. He showed up in his glory. He made him known. But then God says, "I will glorify it," which is referring to Jesus' death and resurrection, that you will see God through the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Now notice the crowd's reaction. I love the crowd's reaction here. There's spiritual people in the crowd, right? They're the ones who yell, "It's thunder," right? We've seen a natural phenomenon that has shown us something, that is crying out to us, that's giving us a spiritual experience. Something is speaking in the thunder. And then there's religious people in the crowd too, right? They say, "No, it was an angel. It must have been." They've got this category of their tradition, of their religion that it has to fit into. We know angels. This experience must fit into the angelic prophecy. But it's not a natural phenomenon or a spiritual experience. It's not a religious type or trope. It's a person. It's a voice. God himself is revealing himself through his son Jesus. And then he says that he will draw all people to himself by being lifted up on a cross, high on a hill where everyone can see. He will draw people to himself, and that at that cross he will judge all sin, all evil, all wickedness, and even death itself will bow at the death of Jesus. So if you want to know God, if you want to see God, abstract spirituality is not enough. It's not a clear enough picture. And religion and religious practices and moral living are not enough. In fact, it's not even enough to study the life and the teaching of Jesus. You have to see a person lifted up high on a cross, cleansing you and covering you as to remove the barrier between you and God. You see God at the cross of Jesus. Because the cross is where the impure, the inadequate people come to receive the grace and forgiveness and the covering and the cleansing they need to stand in the presence of a holy God. The author of Hebrews sums it up really well. He says it like this in Hebrews 4, referring to the death of Jesus. "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. See, the only thing that can satisfy our spiritual longings is a person. So if you're in here and you would call yourself spiritual, like, yeah, I believe some spiritual things. I don't know exactly what, but I would say I'm a spiritual person. You need to know that occasional abstract spiritual experiences will not sustain you in times of difficulty. Like whether it's real life suffering or pain, or maybe it's your own sense of inadequacy or guilt or shame, like you get caught or life falls apart or it's not the way that you imagined, abstract spirituality and mystical experiences will not sustain you. But Jesus is not abstract. His death occurred in space, time, and history to cover you and to cleanse you so that you can walk confidently into God's presence, knowing a person. And if you're in here and you would call yourself religious, or maybe a Christian, or a person of faith, or a church person, you need to know trying hard to be good or moral to earn God's acceptance will lead you no closer to him than if you ran in the opposite direction. Striving to meet a moral standard that you've set for yourself or that you've set up for yourself as a form of religion will not in any way bring you close to this person. In fact, if you've recently been aware of your sin or been caught in something or made a mistake or felt failure, here's a great question to test yourself. Do you feel like God is disappointed in you? Do you feel like he's ashamed of you? Do you feel like he's hidden himself from you? And I'd ask you that, do you see God through his son on a cross, asking you to confidently walk into his presence? Do you see a God saying, I've taken care of you. I've died for you. I've gone to the farthest extent possible to bring you into my presence, to bring you into relationship with me. Now rest secure on my chest, child, in the bosom of the Father. Now, I want to encourage all of us here to spend some time, either this week or in the next month, reading some parts of the Gospels or reading the Gospels in full. Read parts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, any one of them. And as you encounter the person of Jesus, think about this. In every single way he is described, that's our God. You're seeing the clearest picture of God, and you're getting the most full and complete revelation of him. And then see him raised up on a cross in order to cover you and to cleanse you so you can walk into relationship and into the presence of God confidently. Would you pray with me? God, it is a magnificent gift that you've given us through your son Jesus, who died on a cross to bring us to you. In fact, the only way that I can talk to you right now as if I'm talking to a friend is because of what Jesus has done on our behalf. And so, God, I ask for my friends in this room that they would see you today. Whether they've never really felt like they've seen you or they feel like their religion or their following you has gone stale, that they would see you today in all of your goodness and all of your perfection and all of your beauty, and they would know that because of the cross of Jesus Christ. And so show up for us today, God, that we might see you and enter into your presence confidently. I pray this in Christ's name. Amen.